And really, the process is saying the sentence, sub-vocalizing it in your head until there's nothing wrong with it. But this means not repeating in the same sentence suffixes and prefixes. If you've got a confound, you can't have a conform. I think the prose will give a sort of pleasure without you being able to tell why.
Well, this is a sort of an emergency podcast of sorts. As we're recording it, it feels a bit like an emergency or an urgency podcast, given that my next guest, the author and journalist David Patrikarakos, is due to leave the UK, but informed me a few weeks back that he is mildly obsessed with Martin Amos, and I think that's a prerequisite for appearing on this series. So welcome, David.
Well, thanks, Jack. I'm actually delighted to be here because, as you say, I'm mildly obsessed with Martin Amos, which always seems like a bit of a cliche because who isn't, I think, in many ways. But yeah, I'm delighted to do this and to talk about a writer that was formative for me, as he was formative for so many others, and who I always thought I would meet, but I never did. And then it was too late. So always try and meet your idols, to go against the cliche.
Yeah, would you say that it is better to meet them than to not meet them?
I always thought at some point we'd be in the same place or overlapping at some event. And so I just assumed that I would be able to meet him, but in the end, I didn't, and it was too late.
And so when did you discover Martin Amos? How old were you and what brought you to his work?
So I was thinking about this yesterday because I knew we were doing this today, and it's clear to me, I think I was 13 or 14, and I came to him because the Rachel Papers was on my mother's bookshelf, and there were many, many bookshelves in our house in my family home growing up, and I picked it up off the shelf. And to use another cliche, I never looked back.
Well, we are going to be discussing cliches on this episode because, of course, as well as the Rachel Papers, you wanted to talk about the war against cliche, and it's inevitable, as I said on my episode with James Marriott, that we will be using cliches throughout because I think after discovering Martin Amos's writing, you realise that you're using cliches all the time and you don't even check yourself. You know, we can't spend all our lives trying to rehabilitate ourselves out of using cliches. But where do we want to begin?
So, I mean, the book I really want to talk about is the Racial Papers, but I think the preoccupation he had with cliches and the problems he had with cliches, the dangers he felt they contained, orbit all of his work, I think. This preoccupation casts its shadow across everything he wrote, and I guess he most fully articulated his line of argument in The War Against Cliche, which is, of course, a collection of essays, specifically in a piece he wrote that was reading, I think, Michael Crichton's The Lost World. And he talks about, herds of cliches wandering around. He uses the dinosaur analogy to great effect, and all of these phrases: acutely aware, sickening thud, deafening roar.
Reptilian reptiles.
Yeah, reptilian reptiles. Yeah, and he has this wonderful intro about dinosaurs, and his kids are obsessed with dinosaurs. But I think in the end that for him, cliches are used thought, and therefore to be avoided, they're also obfuscatory. And the thing with Amos that everyone talks around is his preoccupation with style, but it was never just about style. For Amos, style was morality. And if you look at some of the most authoritarian types of prose, they're couched in cliche. It's what Orwell, and I'm paraphrasing here, calls that, the sort of bolt together sentences. They almost become like, form like a copy table. So you just bolt them together and you're not really thinking. And I think that's really important. I think actually it's what makes him quite similar to Orwell, which is very interesting because he didn't like Orwell. He thought Orwell was a bad writer. There's that famous line of his when Christopher Hitchens tries to get him to read Animal Farm. And he gets to the sentence where Orwell describes a character as ruggedly handsome, which is, of course, a terrible cliche. And he throws away the book and says the man can't write worth a damn or something. But I think in that sense, they were actually more similar than Amos would have liked to admit, although in later years he did conclude that there was some value to Orwell.
A couple of very interesting counterintuitive points you've already made. The fact that Martin Amos didn't like Orwell's writing style as a novelist, but at the same time chimed very much with Orwell's belief about the barbarism of bad prose, bad writing, and its connection to thought. Also, you write in Unheard that Martin Amos was not a great political writer. He failed a lot when he tried to wade into political debate. But also an awful lot of what he said about style and morality and the avoidance of cliche, it's been formative of your understanding of the world as a political journalist.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think it's a very percipient point as well. I mean, the thing with Amos is that when you come to him, I don't know if it was John Carey, maybe I'm misquoting, you read his book, any book by him, and, you finish and the world seems less alive, less dynamic. I mean, he makes you alive to the possibilities of prose. And the cliche thing is interesting because language is obviously the way that we communicate. And if you look at, let's say, Putin's Russia, if you look at Mao's China, and it's certainly, of course, Stalin's Russia, the use of language is vital to the means of authoritarianism. If you ever read, for example, going back to Nazi Germany now, the report of Anne Frank's arrest, it's really interesting. Everything is written in the passive voice. She was taken, she was boom, boom, boom. And I think there's one active sentence, which is the line about her execution. And in that rather bland but utterly chilling paragraph or so, you can see through bad prose, as I say, the obfuscatory, weaselly, fundamentally dishonest nature of authoritarianism. So the point that both he and Orwell made, I think, is very, very important. Authoritarian regimes need to hide, funnily enough, even though they're overtly authoritarian, and the best way to do this is in prose. Now, cliches are interesting because in prose they are to be avoided, they're dead language. But actually in life, cliches are very valuable because they have aphoristic value. Cliches are essentially statements or aphorisms proved by experience. Another thing that Amos obviously was very interested in when he wrote a book called Experience. So I think ideas of cliche are interesting, and you separate them in prose where they're anathema, and in life where actually they're very good heuristic ways of understanding the world.
This is true, and this is why I say that we use cliches all the time. The priority in life is to bridge a connection and understanding, and the best way to do that is to often use phrases that will instantly make that connection. But again, I don't want to dwell too much on the war against cliche, because the book, as you say, that you really want to talk about is the Rachel Papers, and I'm very, very interested to learn why you've chosen this book, but also to discuss at some stage or other, given its connection to the Rachel Papers, given that the Rachel Papers is all about a man who treats sex as scholarship and scholarship as sensual. A copy of Hamlet that is particularly special.
Well, I mean, you've brought it up now. Yeah, this is rather sad, I'm afraid. I bought a copy of Hamlet, which is possibly my favourite text, that was owned by Martin Amos as an undergraduate at Oxford, from a dealer on Charing Cross Road many, many years ago.
And may I ask how much it sold for?
I think it was £150, which back then was quite a lot of money. It was still quite a lot of money. And it has his marginalia in it, which is wonderful. It also has a bookplate in it. It has his Ex Libris Martin Amos. Now, you imagine having a bookplate when you're 19 years old. So it gives you some idea of what kind of undergraduate he was. Actually, I have a friend whose father was at Exeter College with him. And he said when they turned up, Martin Amos was the only student that read every book on the entire reading list before they got here.
Wow.
Unfortunately, it just has one or two notes in green ink. But yeah, I cherish that a lot. Martin Amos and Hamlet, I think that's a perfect storm for me. But the Rachel Papers, I mean, why does it mean so much? I think with books, a large degree of it is when they come to you in your life. And as I say, that is a very formative period for me. I'm 14 years old and I pick up the Rachel Papers and I read, "My name is Charles Highway, though you wouldn't think it to look at me." And bang, that's it. I'm hooked. I fell in love.
What was it about that opening sentence that hooked you?
Well, it's just so simple and declarative and clever. And it sets you up for everything that's to come. And I'd never read anything quite like it. It was, I guess, the book that introduced me to quote-unquote adult books. You know, I'd read Graham Greene. He's one of those writers Zadie Smith talks about. Graham Greene is this bridging writer, you know, the sort of first grown-up, heavy air quotes, novels that you read. But for me, it was the Rachel Papers. And, you know, I read it probably in one sitting. And I can't even remember how many times I've read it in my life. But there was a point where you could open the book up at any page, put your thumb somewhere or your finger somewhere, and I could tell you what was before and after it.
Wow. So, as you know, the last person to speak about the Rachel Papers on this series, the first person, in fact, was Zoe Strimpel, who chose it because she said it gave her, as a young woman growing up through puberty, a feeling that she was getting closer to an understanding of how young men really think about sex, how they think about women, how they think about the experience of conquest and what there is to win out of youth. What was it about Charles Highway that you connected to?
Okay, so let's go back to Hamlet again. Coleridge famously said, "I have a smack of the Hamlet about me." And I always thought, well, who doesn't, Samuel? This is the thing. Hamlet is an angst-ridden undergraduate, essentially, when you strip away everything else. And if you're a certain type, literary sort of, especially when you're young, angst-ridden undergraduate or schoolboy, then it resonates with you. And Charles Highway is very much like that. But I would say this. I completely understand Zoe Strimpel's point. I mean, reading that as a woman, I imagine it's very different. But I'm not sure if you're actually meant to identify with Charles Highway so much. Look, there's a lot that's appealing about him. He's very smart. He's very funny. But he's a bit of a douchebag as well. And I think that is deliberate. I mean, the thing with Charles Highway, in the end, is that most young boys and girls want to be novelists. He doesn't. He wants to be a critic. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, of course. But it sort of feeds into this wider thing, and it's all about artifice. Does Charles Highway represent what young men think about women? In a sense that, he's always trying to get laid and he's very anxious about it, yes. But I think he's a satirical creation. I mean, the Rachel papers, the techniques, and I forget the phrase, but, the maps he has, the techniques for trying to seduce women are absurd. Although, actually, I guess it prefigured in many ways those pickup artists that became really big on the internet, the so-called Red Pill Brigade. But I see Charles Highway fundamentally as a satirical creation. And I think is interesting because, there's a lot about him that's quite an unreliable narrator. You see in this book so many of the preoccupations that would come to characterize so much of Amos's writing. America, his philo-Semitism, class. And there is that scene where he goes to see the Blatterbys. The Blatterbys, look at that sort of quasi-Dickensian name. It has echoes, indeed, of the Jellybees in Bleak House. He says, genial condescension is the word that he kind of uses when he's talking about how Charles sort of looks at them, or that's certainly a phrase that's in that paragraph. And then he walks away and he's thinking, they must be there thinking, Charles, fucking nice guy. And you think probably they don't quite think that of him. So, as I say, I think Charles Highway is, in certain degrees, an appealing character, but in other ways, clearly a satirical creation set up to puncture some of this ideas of artifice, because, the whole thing is essentially quite fake in the way that he behaves. And actually, if you ever see the film, it's always interesting to see how films and books differ, because in The Remains of the Day, this novel in which a butler and I think is she the housemaid, are in love with each other, but because they're so English, they can never actually say anything. In the film, Emma Thompson, who plays the lady of the house, the maid, says to Anthony Hopkins, the butler, "The house needs you." And what she's really saying is, "I need you." Now, that never happens in the book. In the Rachel Papers film, there's a point where his sister, Jenny, turns and says, "Charles, this is very transparent." His whole act, which never happens in the book. So they're teasing out, for a visual audience, what is implicit in the text. And I think that is that this is all very transparent. And then many times where you think, there's that wonderful scene where he takes her to an exhibition and he goes the day before and rehearses everything. And you remember because you're laughing. And he says, and I would do it here by the window so the shadows would be flickering across my face. And he gives this whole speech. And at the end she says, "See that young boy over there? He's wearing pajamas on underneath his clothes." And that's very clear about what's going on here. And it's Charles Highway essentially falling flat on his arse because what he's doing is ridiculous.
You talk about what's implicit in the text versus what's spelled out for a visual audience. But remember, you came to this novel at the age of 14. I came to it at the age of 17. And I very much doubt that all of those implicit things in the text were explicit to you then. Hence why I asked what you connected with Charles Highway. Because to all intents and purposes, Charles Highway is a satirical creation. But he is also somebody a bit like Holden Caulfield in Catcher in the Rye, who young men come to and feel in some way vindicated by.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I go back to that Coleridge quote, I have a smack of the Hamlet about me. It's the same with Charles Highway. And also, I'd never read anything like it. I'd read Shakespeare then, which is, of course, supreme, but it's very different. Charles Highway essentially writes in the demotic, right? It was prose that was immediately recognisable to me, even if it was written before I was born. So there's something just electric about the whole thing, and I think that's what drew me in. And Charles Highway is very funny, and he's very smart. And there's this line where he says English literature, which seemed to me that I was really fucking good at, and I think that hits a certain type of young man as well. So yeah, there are those things that connect. And then, like the descriptions of sex, we talk about the preoccupations or the leitmotifs or the things that really characterize Martin Amos, and one of those is that viscerality. I mean, the actual viscerality of the prose, the images in which it conjures in your head. I think it was Will Lloyd or it was someone else talking about at his eulogy. Julian Barnes talks about, I think it was Julian Barnes, I could be wrong, about, he was trying to describe someone defecating into a loo, and he came up with like the sound of melons into a well.
That's
and
right.
It had to be not coconuts, not a river, but melons into a well. And if you actually think about that, the sheer visual image, the viscerality of it, is quite striking.
I remember being sat at the memorial, and that description got probably the longest laugh. Perhaps it's too early in the morning for a very visceral or lurid description of sex, but it sounds to me like there are any number of passages that you could pick out of the Rachel papers and read. Perhaps I don't even need to give you the copy of the book. You seem to know the whole thing off by heart.
No, I'm going to read the one that I've touched upon already. My name is Charles Highway, though you wouldn't think it to look at me. It's such a rangy, well-travelled, big-cocked name, and, to look at, I am none of these. I wear glasses for a start, have done since I was 9, and my medium-length, arseless, waistless figure, corrugated ribcage, and bandy legs gang up to dispel any hint of aplomb. Brackets. On no account, by the way, should this particular model be confused with the springy frames so popular among my contemporaries. They're quite different. I remember I used to have to fold the bands of my trousers almost double, and bulk out the seats with shirts intended for grown men. I dress more thoughtfully now, though, not so much with taste as with insight. But I have got one of those fashionable, reedy voices, the ones with the habitual ironic twang, excellent for the promotion of oldster unease. And I imagine there's something oddly daunting about my face, too. It's angular yet delicate, thin long nose, wide thin mouth, and the eyes, richly lashed, dark ochre, with a twinkle of singed auburn. Ah, how inadequate these words seem.
When you read through Amos's old copy of Hamlet, which I'd love to take a peek at later, by the way, and you look at the marginalia, which I hope is legible.
It is. Unfortunately, there's only 2 phrases. I think it's one in the to be or not to be speech, and he says, not yet tragic, obfuscatory. I'll dig it out.
And when you do read through those notes, do you get a flavour or a hint or a waft of Charles Highway?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, clearly. I mean, who writes notes like that? And he has a book plate at the age of 18 or 19. I mean, maybe it was the thing to do when he would have been there, yeah. In the
Amos was
60s.
certainly precocious.
Certainly. I mean, the Rachel Papers comes out, in 73, when he's 24 years old. It's depressing, actually. Depressing. I used to have, or I still have, I guess, this neurotic ability to tell you roughly when most great novelists wrote their first novel, how old they were. Because for years it was George Eliot keeping me going at 40. But that's past now. Anthony Burgess as well, who Amos loved, actually.
And then there was Virginia Woolf, who said that no one should publish anything before the age of 30.
Yes, well, good for Virginia. I think things are changing now, actually. It's interesting because novelists are getting older. Back in the day, you got a pension and retired at 65 because you very politely died at 70. You see a lot of first novelists now, Shuggie Bain, for example, 45 years old, I think. And Amos talks about this, actually. He talks about being able to make a living from reviewing books. He says all that changed with the OPEC oil crisis. Now I think a lot of people are in their 40s or are middle-aged before they have the financial ability to take time out to try and write a novel. So all of these things are changing. Amos, Ishiguro and McEwan, were always of the belief that novelists wrote their best stuff in their 30s. Which was true for a long time, although there's so many exceptions that I actually don't think that's correct. But I think the world is changing now. People are living longer. And as I say, the financial situation of everything is different. So that's kind of changed a lot. I mean, Amos famously, as you say, precocious. I mean, everything he did was precocious. I mean, everything about him. If you look about who his father was, and that's another thing, obviously, you get in the Rachel Papers, this problematic relationship he has with his dad. Gordon Highway, I think his name is.
That's right.
He's trying to write him this letter, and he can't write this letter, and there's those scenes with his sister as well, and nothing is said. And actually, I think maybe that's the first time that perhaps he strays into slight mawkishness, even though the book attempts to do the opposite when he says, about his sister, I think we both wanted to talk. I don't know why we didn't. So you have that thing. And I mean, the Jewish thing is really interesting because the thing with Martin Amos is, as you'll know, it's not just his books. There's a whole canon around the books because he was such a star. All the things he said, the interviews, the this, the that, which you don't really get anymore, actually, because it's a thing I think about as well, which is that novelists have been really culturally decentered. When I was growing up, Martin Amos, Ian McEwan, Salman Rushdie, Amos was on the front page of the newspapers. The books pages of the newspapers were so much larger. There were these famous feuds. That doesn't exist anymore. I mean, McEwan and Rushdie are still huge, but they're dinosaurs now, and people keep trying to kill Salman Rushdie, so it keeps him in the news. But I can't think of any young equivalents, really. I mean, there's Zadie Smith, of course, but even she's pushing 50 now. But back in the day, they were big stars. So you have all of this stuff around the books. So it's not what just Amos wrote, but it's what he said. And all these have come to be woven into the Amos canon. And this philo-Semitism, Rachel, he thinks is Jewish. Rachel is obviously a Jewish name. And names are obviously very important for Amos. Like, Rachel's name is Rachel Noyes, but it's no, yes, which is what Rachel does. She says no, 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 and then yes, which I guess is also problematic these days. And you really see, again, this philo-Semitism in Amos's work. His obsession with Saul Bellow, for example, the fact that Saul Bellow is essentially a surrogate father for him.
If you read through Amos's anecdotal works, experience, and the inside story, you get some idea as to what that was really about, his philo-Semitism. What's your opinion of it?
Well, as someone who's Jewish as well. So it's interesting because the reason I was bringing it back, or the reason I brought it up at this point, is that we talk about the relationship with the father. Now, it comes from many things. I think his literary heroes were Jewish, so I think that helps. I think in that world as well, on the left, actually, fun enough, it was the time when everyone was pro-Israel. I remember him, is it an Inside Story, when he says to Hitchens, I met someone today who was pro-Arab. He couldn't believe it, and that was a reactionary right-winger. But there's also this thing about his father, right? Because he says famously, and this is what I'm talking about, there's the canon, right? There's nothing that he wrote in a novel or in a book, but that he said in an interview, and he says to his father, what's it like to be mildly anti-Semitic? And he says, nothing much really. I just watch the BBC Arts programmes, and when the credits come up and I see a Jewish name, I think, oh, there's another one, there's another one. And in Stanley and the Women, Kingsley Amos's book, there is a line where he's driving through Hampstead and he passes the Bishop's Avenue, and he says, the Bishop's Avenue where the Jew boys live. So I think there's a reaction against that as well, much in the same way, actually, that when you read Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, I think part of it is a reaction against this canonization. And I don't mean literal, but like the societal canonization of Thomas More, who she clearly despises. I'm not saying Martin Amos despises his father, but I think in Wolf Hall you can see a pushback against that. And I think to a degree, you can see that in Amos. But as I said, there's other things. I mean, if you look at, he's obsessed with American literature. He's obsessed with America. That's another thing you have in the Rachel papers with the character of DeForest Hoeniger, because he's obsessed with their names. And you see this in Money, right? Fielding Goodney. I mean, naming is really important for Amos, just like it was really important for Dickens. And I talked about earlier, the Bladderbees, which is this echo of the Jellybees. And in Night Train, there is a character called Tulkinghorn, who is the lawyer from Bleak House. And Tulkinghorn is not like Smith, like Patrikarakos, like you put that name in for a reason. And so I think, and especially with Dickens, who Amos also liked, who's another novelist of London, because for all of his Americanism, he writes a lot of novels that are essentially about London, most of all, obviously, London Fields. So I just think the Rachel Papers is really interesting because it sets up, in a sense, the type of novelist Amos is going to become. He wrote, the first novelist is condemned to autobiography. So to a degree, there's obviously much of Charles Highway in Martin Amos. But you see the viscerality, you see America, you see philo-Semitism, you see class, which is really important to Amos. There's the character Gloria, who he says holds the assistant saleswomanship position in a pet food store, very condescending. And he's typologizing her, and I think he describes her as working class / underclass, which is, of course, funny, but at the same time, it shows a relation with class and obviously what a douchebag Charles Highway is.
In a previous episode, the writer Graham Caveney said that when he was going through university in the early to mid-80s, there was a real dearth of new literature coming out of the UK. They had this sense that all the interesting things were happening on the other side of the pond. And with Money, he said, Amos really invited writers to look west and engage with America and American style and American substance, American distempers and distortions.
Let's not forget as well, what was probably also formative for him is he spends a year there, doesn't he, as a child, when Kingsley is an academic at an American university. I think so, because he disliked parochialism, and Britain, in terms of its literary scene, was quite parochial at the time. And look, Ian McEwan was another big novelist, but Ian McEwan's a deeply English novelist, like in a way that Amos isn't. So I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I have this theory, which is not impregnable, but it's not, I don't think you can be completely disproved either, which is that the nations tend to be most culturally powerful at times when they seem to be most geopolitically powerful. So Sophocles writes, I mean, his greatest tragedy pretty much at the apex of Pericles' reign. You know, the Aeneid is written under Augustus. The French and Russian novels are in the 19th century. The great English novels are in the 19th century, the height of Victorian power. And actually, it's interesting, look at the 20th century. The first half of the 20th century, yeah, you've got Faulkner and stuff, but then you've got Evelyn Waugh, you've got George Orwell, and I think the Brits really are, you know, ahead. But after the Second World War, you know, and when America rises to the fore, you know, we have Bellow, Updike, Roth, Mailer, and then you've got McEwan, Rushdie, Amos. It's not even, is it? So you see America really take off culturally, especially in terms of its literary output. And then there's cinema as well, although that predates the war. So I think Amos understood this, and he understood that the best prose in English was no longer being written in Britain, but in America, and he was right.
And of course, another huge literary influence on Amos, Vladimir Nabokov, who wasn't from America but from Russia, is somebody you've written about extensively in your posthumous appraisal of Amos as having given Martin Amos some of the sort of founding methods to his prose. Nabokov was brilliant, as you said, at the process of what he termed rapture and recapture. Perhaps this is something you can explain.
Yeah, so Nabokov, he sets out this process of artistic creation, which, as you say, divides into two stages. Rapture, Vostorg, and recapture, which is Vdukhovny, and I've mispronounced that, I've butchered it, so I apologise. And it's about, essentially, you break down the world and you reconstruct it. And this is the thing, I mean, Martin Amos, again, in this wider Amos canon, not what he wrote, but I think what he said, he talks about, for an artist, for a writer, why is the world as it is? Why do cars look like they look like? Why? Why does it have to be like that? Why does a tree look like that? So you dismantle everything. And in the Rachel papers, Charles Highway is walking down an ordinary street in which everything seems alien, and he writes, demonically mechanical cars, potent, solid living trees, unreal, distant-seeming buildings, blotchy extraterrestrial wayfarers. And again in the Information, Richard Tull, who is, and I quote, an artist when he saw society. It never crossed his mind that society had to be like this, had any right, had any business being like this. And Tull is in the end a man, and I quote again, harassed to the point of insanity or stupefaction by first principles. And it's about perception, right? You break everything down and then you recalibrate the way you see the world. So when he writes on Bellow's Augie March, and he provides what is a really succinct credo of his literary beliefs, and he writes, style, of course, is not something grappled onto regular prose. It is intrinsic to perception. We are fond of separating style and content, brackets for the purpose of analysis and so on. But they aren't separable. They come from the same place. And style is morality, which is circling back to what we said. And, you know, he is a satirist, which is to say a moralist.
See, I related very closely to what you wrote about with regards to first principles. I took from his work the point that the most exciting thing about writing was the opportunity to deconstruct everything and start over, which is a very tricky path to tread, isn't it? Your attempts to reframe everything and to give it your own spin and to avoid cliche can lead to some really fuck-awful writing, because you're trying something that is psychologically and linguistically very, very hard to do, which is to make things sensible that are counterintuitive.
Oh yeah, because that's the point of a really great writer, is not to say, oh wow, I'd never thought of that, but to say, yes, that's true, but I never could have expressed it like that. And it's about the accuracy. This is the thing. Amos writes in the demotic, and that's really important. It's not obfuscatory. Yes, the language, the vocabulary can be sometimes, back in the day, I'd have to look words up. But the point is, it's immediate and recognizable, and that's the brilliance.
And it didn't always land. Leo Robson on a previous episode talks about his description of a pub in London Fields, where by the end, you're just reeling from the kaleidoscopic hallucination that he's created about something as mundane as the lurch towards the bar to order a pint. But he still manages it. He still just about gets it over the line.
I once read in an article, someone, I forget who it was, saying every young male novelist tries to write like Martin Amos. Every young male novelist fails to write like Martin Amos. So Martin Amos is actually, I think, an influence that's both good and bad. He's good in the sense that he makes you alive to the possibilities of prose. Martin Amos is to a large degree why I became a writer. But also, he stifles your progress because you have to get past that stage of trying to write like him. You just have to. It's almost like a rite of passage now. Then you realise you can't, and it's dreadful, and then you get past it. So, yeah, absolutely on that. Don't I ever do anything else but take soulful walks down the Bayswater Road, I thought, as I walked soulfully down the Bayswater Road. Very well. Demonically mechanical cars, potent solid living trees, unreal distant-seeming buildings, blotchy extraterrestrial wayfarers, intense consciousness of being, pathetic fallacy plus omnipresent deja vu, cosmic angst, metaphysical fear, a feeling both claustrophobic and agoraphobic, the teenager's religion. And that actually is very much, that's where you hear a bit of Hamlet.
To be writing that at the age of 24.
Well, he would have written it earlier.
Yes,
it was published
exactly.
At 20.
You wonder to yourself, did Martin Amos really experience this angst? Or did he understand it too well to experience it?
I mean, there's a line in it where he talks about, it's not about problems, it's just the capacity of worrying about them, which is essentially like Epictetus. It's just essentially the essence of Stoicism. Now, for someone of that age to actually get that is really, 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 really precocious, because the whole point of being a teenager and being young is that you have no sense of perspective.
And yet, again, Martin Amos was a man riddled with fears.
Yes.
I mean, he took a little bit after Kingsley for having particular phobias.
Completely. Kingsley was terrified of the dark, famously, which he talks about he writes about in Experience.
Incredible, wasn't it? I mean, just the range of fears that Kingsley Amis faced, which is sometimes, I think, what writers aspire to achieve. They want to overcome their fears by grappling with them so tightly that they can tame them and wield them and put them in their place.
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, in a lot of the war correspondent stuff I do, I would say, is similar impulses at play.
I was about to ask, in fact, whether a lot of what you do is an attempt to confront your fears.
Yeah, I would say so, and it's an attempt to confront ideas of fear. Or what does fear mean, and how will I deal with it in that particular situation? But it's a very specific kind of fear. It's a physical fear, I guess, which I feel less than other fears, than, perhaps more emotional or mental fears. And this is the thing with Charles Highway. He has that anxiety top 10. These wonderful things, Spot having a smaller cock than DeForest, all of those, really adolescent things. And the thing about being a teenager and being young, it is about fears. I remember I was having this conversation with someone the other week and thinking, looking back to being an undergraduate, and I'm like, I was lying in bed till 1, I was miserable, I was depressed, and I actually had no problems. I had no problems in the world. I didn't have a job, I had 3 years to do whatever I wanted, a few hours of lectures a week. I had no problems in the world, but, I spent a lot of it miserable. Such is the way of these things. So here's a cliche, which I think we talk about cliches in prose being used thought and to be avoided, but in life having aphoristic value, and here is the one that I think above all else stands. Youth is wasted on the young. If I knew what I knew now, there's that other thing, what's the greatest superpower in the world? Hindsight. But he captures with Charles Highway, as you said, the claustrophobia and agoraphobia, but the anxiety, the crippling anxiety that he has to manage, the familial tensions, the familial pain that he has that he can't deal with, that he can't articulate and can't express. And that's the interesting thing, right? That he is so articulate, he's hyper-articulate, but he can't speak. In the interactions with his father, he never says what he wants to say, and then he writes this letter, and then I think at various points he tells us how long the letter is now, and it's obviously comically long. But if memory serves, he never even sends it. So you have this guy who is, hyper-articulate, but actually in points when it really matters, he can't speak. And it's interesting because a lot of what he does say, the great speeches about Blake and stuff is nonsense, essentially. He does have a kind of, I wouldn't say anagnorisis, but when he goes for his Oxford interview, and the guy essentially tells him he's full of shit, he says, how do you educate someone urgently? All of this stuff that he's written. And he says in the end, look, I'll take you if I don't someone else's, and you'll only get worse. But you have this kind of culmination of it. What is Charles Highway's hamartia? What is his fatal flaw? And then he comes to, the Oxford Don, who's the corporate embodiment of this thing that's all going towards, he wants to go to Oxford. And he essentially tells him he's full of shit. Now, does he learn anything, though? That's the thing. Does Charles Highway learn something? I mean, to a degree. I mean, you kind of think, though, he probably would have ended up being a smart-ass literary critic. And, there's that thing which says, I saw Rachel many years later in an art gallery, which I think is also very sweet and good, because this is what happens with young loves. And you bump into them years later, and you look at this person who, was, you were racked with this and that. It was all so important and terrible and great and this and that. And, you see them and they're another sort of story in your life. And Amos, again, there's another thing in the Amos, what would you call it? Would you call it the wider ages marginalia, the apocrypha? No, it's not apocrypha. Is that he talks about love affairs being your pension in old age. You will live on the memories in your old age. And obviously an inside story, we get the story of the real Rachel. She's never named, but Rachel is obviously based on a real person who was Jewish, or maybe still is Jewish. I don't know. So you have this great intersection of with Amos. It's always about the life as well. I think, is it in Yellow Dog, where he writes, "Don't be silly," which is this line that Christopher Hitchens writes in response to his review of Cobra the Dread, when he headlines it, "Don't be silly," because Hitchens obviously studied politics, a great expert on Stalin. So you have this porousness between the work of Amos and the life of Amos, and the two end up feeding each other, and it reaches its conclusion in Inside Story, more so than Experience, which is an autobiography of sorts. But Inside Story, where he blends the fact and the fiction, and Rachel reappears again at the end of his life.
What do you think about the mutual envy that Hitchens and Amos shared? Hitchens would mope and sulk and pine for the company of Amos because Amos had something he wanted, which was that ability to write so beautifully. It was Amos, I think, who was able over time to persuade and coach and nudge Hitchens towards a more elegant form of writing, because he says, he was a brilliant pamphleteer, but his writing was very, very bolt-on.
Almost Orwellian, I guess, in that sense. That mutual envy thing is interesting because, I remember reading a piece by Hitchens, and he says that, Amos took one of his pieces and he corrected, and I quote, his salt and pepper punctuation. Was there mutual envy? Look, I think for years, and actually, I don't think. Hitchens freely admits it. Marn Amos was a giant, and Hitchens was always in his shadow. And I think that, he says, he sleeps with Marn Amos's sister, and he says, it was the wrong, it was the wrong Amos that I was sleeping with. I wished I was sleeping with the other Amos. He's quite open about that. And for years, he was in Marn Amos's shadow. But what is interesting is that post 9/11, Hitchens kind of becomes this global journalistic figure. I'd say at his death, he was Jason Cowley in the New Statesman in his obituary says he has no equal in Anglo-American letters. I think at that stage he was right. So he becomes more famous than Marn Amos, I would say. And it's funny because that's when you see Amos's real preoccupation with Islamism. I know it comes from obviously 9/11 and stuff, but there's almost a role reversal. Obviously he's not as great a writer as Amos. Obviously Amos will last, and he won't in the same way. But he becomes almost it becomes bigger, I would say, than Amos, quote unquote. And you see, I think, the influence on Amos, and he becomes more political. He always had these preoccupations. I guess you can put some of them down to Hitchens. The book he wrote on Stalin. Obviously, how many hours must he have spent discussing Stalin with Hitchens? And then the Islam and stuff, and he tries to become more overtly political, and he just can't do it. And he says, for someone who's such a careful writer, he says stupid things, when he talks about in an interview, about, what does he say about searching a lot of Muslim, or making the Muslim community suffer?
Yeah, until it gets its house in order, which again was a cliche used for political purposes. Amos, I think, revealed that tetchy, quick to anger, fearful side to himself when he wrote politically.
Yeah, it's almost like he was curdling into Kingsley.
If you're speaking to a room full of aspirant journalists today, you might well bring up Christopher Hitchens, but would you be keener for them to read Amos to learn how...
Yes. 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 I thought Hitchens was an important and powerful and robust voice, but I don't think I've read anything of his since he's gone. Amos I have.
What is it about Amos's work that you think is of value to journalists in particular? Remembering, of course, that many journalists, like myself, started by reading Amos, got a job in journalism, and were duly slapped down by editors saying, "What the fuck is this shit?"
Yeah. Can you imagine? It must be the bane of editors anyway. They're like, oh God, another one. Yeah, I actually, when I was at uni, my friend found a section of my dreadful novel, which he still laughs about, and it was, you look at it now, and it's just trying to write like Martin Amos. It's just toe-curlingly bad. But I would think, look, for the same reason that I love Amos, and in the end, it is this. He makes you alive to the possibilities of prose. And in whatever work that you do that involves writing, being alive to the possibilities of prose, what it can do, what it shouldn't do, what you should avoid, I think is absolutely key for any writer. And look, I mean, he can be too prescriptive sometimes,
Have you got a good example of where he's...
Well, yes, you cannot use any words with the same ending in a sentence, so you can't use ing and ing or something. I just happen to just disagree with this.
I try to abide by that, actually. I know what he's getting at. The thing is, he always talks about euphony, doesn't he?
Yeah,
and he says if you have an echo of a prefix or an ending to a word, you get that kind of annoying sort of jab in your ear.
So yeah, I mean, I get it, but sometimes you just don't have the time, because sometimes life is short. But he was just a preternatural talent. That's the thing. Because obviously he says, well, first of all, it's a very pompous thing, but he says, I'm a living V-sign to egalitarianism, right? Which is a very pompous thing to say because of his father. And he says, probably any publisher would have published my first novel out of, and the crazy, I think, morbid curiosity because of who his father was. But in a way, it's harder because look at the sons and daughters of famous fathers everywhere. It's rare that they succeed in the same field, right? But he does it. I mean, the Rachel Papers is a great book, and there is, again, we talk about the wider Amos apocrypha, whatever you want to call it. That's not the right word, but the wider Amos canon. And he says he's on the tube, and he sees someone reading it, and he's just been nominated for the W. Somerset Maugham. He's just won it, and he says, well, I better get used to this. And he never wins another award again.
Is there a last passage that you'd like to read from the Rachel Papers?
Well, this is interesting, right? We talk about the idea of being a teenager, of the angst that comes with it. And he opens a chapter with this paragraph. Now I look round my room, and it seems a companionable place to be. What with the 2 wine bottles, the subdued lighting, the listless but reassuring presence of paper and books. Highways London. One of my notepads has it that I found the room oppressive, sulky with the past, crouching in wan defiance as I turned to look at it on that September Sunday. My word. I suppose I was just moodier then, or more respectful of my moods, more inclined to think that they were worth anything. Now, in so many ways, that really sums up what it's like to be an adolescent. The precociousness, the overwrought prose. And at the end, I guess, what we talked about, his, again, preternaturally mature understanding that actually it's just all about your moods. And in the end, a mood is a mood. Why should you respect it?
David, thank you very much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thanks, Jack.